The veil slipped from her fingers and landed in the mud, trampled by the hooves of horses that had long since ridden away. She stood there trembling as the sun bled out behind the hills, wearing a wedding dress she was never meant to own, her mother's letter clutched tight against her chest. The letter that had lied for her. The letter that had promised a bride who was older, polished, and ready, not a trembling, wide-eyed girl with dirt on her boots and a secret too heavy for her heart to carry. The townsfolk had watched from behind their curtains. The rancher who had ordered the bride shook his head once, turned away, and spat in the dust. He wanted a woman, not a child who barely filled out the dress. The deal was broken. The girl was broken. And no one cared enough to look twice, except one man. A man who hadn't come to buy a bride, but who saw something in her that no one else bothered to see. Hope. Fire. A soul worth fighting for. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something. 97% of the people who listen to my stories never subscribe. If even a small part of today's story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. It's free for you, but it means the world to me. Now, let's continue. The town of Redstone sat crouched beneath a sky so wide it seemed to press the breath out of you. Nothing green grew there, only brittle weeds and stubborn mesquite, and the dust that clung to your clothes no matter how often you beat it out. The streets weren't paved. The buildings leaned into each other like old men with secrets, and every window had a lace curtain pulled just far enough back to watch, to judge, to whisper. Mary Beth Carter had walked those streets for nearly a year now, head down, hands balled into fists inside the pockets of her faded blue skirt. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her voice was so soft you'd wonder if you imagined it. She wasn't like the other girls, the ones who laughed too loudly and batted their lashes at the cowhands stumbling out of Miss Laurel's saloon. Mary Beth had a limp. Not the kind you could pretend away, not the sort that smoothed out when she tried harder. No, hers was a real limp, a dragging of her right foot that caught the eye and curled lips into sneers. A reminder, they said, of the fever she'd survived as a child. A reminder, others muttered, of the curses that seemed to follow her family like a dust storm. In a place like Redstone, a limp was enough to make you less wanted, less worthy, less everything. The town had no pity for the broken. The women pitied themselves enough. The men wanted strong backs, steady legs, and pretty smiles that promised more children to fill the lonely spaces on the ranches. Mary Beth was none of those things. She was too quiet, too wary, and when she smiled, if she smiled at all, it never reached her eyes. It wasn't just the limp that had cursed her. Her mother, Margaret Carter, had been the real beauty once. A mail-order bride herself, arriving fresh-faced and full of dreams. But dreams didn't last in Redstone. Margaret had withered after Mary Beth's father died, and the debts swallowed their farm. By the time Margaret wrote to a rancher across the state to arrange a match, not for herself, but for her daughter, it was already too late. Everyone knew. Everyone whispered. Mary Beth was not the woman described in that letter. She was not 24. She was barely 17. She was not fair and strong and lively. She was thin, tired, and brittle as a willow branch in winter. And worst of all, she wore her mother's old dress like it might tear off her bones if the wind blew hard enough. If this is breaking your heart already, you haven't seen the worst yet. Tap subscribe. I've got another truth waiting for you tomorrow. The silence around Mary Beth was worse than any shouted insult. It was a heavy thing, this silence, a wall that rose higher every day. The other girls crossed the street when they saw her coming. The shopkeepers served her last or not at all. Children giggled behind their hands, daring each other to call her names when her back was turned. Once, a kind old woman, Mrs. Harlow from the feed store, had tried to befriend her, tried to offer a sweet, a stitch of cloth, a warm word. But after her windows were broken one night and a dead crow left hanging from her porch rail, even Mrs. Harlow kept her distance. Mary Beth lived at the edge of town, in a shack that leaned so far to one side you might think a stiff wind would carry it off like a tumbleweed. She lived alone now. Her mother, too sick to ever leave her bed after the journey to Redstone, had passed quietly one morning in the spring, just after the first letter from the rancher had arrived. Mary Beth had buried her herself under the twisted arms of a mesquite tree and marked the spot with a handful of river stones. No priest had come. No bell had tolled. Only the distant cry of a hawk and the sighing wind to bear witness. Her days were spent scrubbing floors, mending torn shirts for pennies, or sweeping out the church when no one else would do it. Her nights were longer than the world. She would sit by the cracked window, staring at the stars, clutching the thin scrap of a letter in her hand. The letter that had promised her a home, a husband, a chance. A letter she hadn't written, but which had sealed her fate all the same. They had laughed when she arrived at the station platform, clutching her worn satchel and wearing her mother's lace gloves. The rancher, a burly man named Josiah Blackwell, had taken one look at her and turned away. "That ain't what I paid for," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. And that was that. No one wanted a broken girl who came in another woman's place. No one wanted a burden, except maybe someone did. Maybe someone had seen the way she bowed her head but still stood her ground. Maybe someone had watched the way she stitched broken things back together with trembling hands and stubborn hope. But not yet. Not today. Today she was still alone, still waiting, still hoping that someday someone might look past the limp, past the silence, past the broken promises, and see her. Truly, see her. The summer sun pressed down so heavy on Redstone that even the dogs lay panting in the shade. Mary Beth kept to the narrow lanes behind the shops, where the breeze still whispered against the cracked brick walls. She had errands, thread for mending, flour if she could spare the coin. But mostly she just walked. It was easier to keep moving than to stay still and feel the walls close in. At the far end of Main Street, the new horses were arriving. A trader had set up a makeshift corral, roping off a patch of dry earth, and townsfolk wandered by to gawk at the animals too fine for this broken town. Mary Beth paused, lingering near the edges where no one would notice her. That's when she saw him. He wasn't from Redstone, that much was plain. He sat easy in the saddle, tall and straight, his hat pulled low to shade his face. Not polished, like the ranchers or mean-eyed like the drifters, just quiet, steady. The stranger dismounted in one slow, practiced move, boots raising a puff of dust as he landed. He handed off the reins with a nod and turned. And for one strange, breathless moment, his eyes caught hers. It wasn't a stare. It wasn't a leer. It wasn't pity. It was a simple look, like you might give the sky before a storm. A glance. That said, "I see you," and asked nothing in return. Mary Beth looked away quickly, heart pounding. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like that. Across the street, Miss Laurel stood with a cluster of townsfolk, fanning herself and whispering behind her hand. A few heads turned toward Mary Beth, sneering, smirking, and she felt her face burn hot. She ducked her head and moved away, limping faster than she ought to on the bad foot. The market stalls blurred around her. She couldn't explain it, didn't want to. But the man's gaze lingered on her skin like sunlight after a storm. Later that afternoon, as she knelt by the feed store, fixing a tear in old Mr. Abbott's sacks for a few coins, she heard the heavy tread of boots. She didn't look up at first. No one spoke to her unless it was to bark orders or mutter complaints. But then a voice, low and rough as the riverbed, broke the silence. "You do good work," he said. Mary Beth froze, needle hovering mid-stitch. Slowly she lifted her eyes. The stranger stood there, holding a battered hat in his hands. Up close he wasn't beautiful, not like the polished sons of ranchers. His face was sun-creased, his jaw shadowed with stubble, a faint scar tugging at one corner of his mouth. But his eyes, gray as storm clouds and just as deep, were kind. "You fixed that saddlebag?" he asked, nodding toward a pile she hadn't noticed before. She shook her head mutely. "You mind?" he asked. No one ever asked her anything. Wordlessly, she reached for the broken leather and set to work. Her fingers moved by instinct, tugging the stitches tight, setting them clean. He knelt beside her, not towering, not crowding, just close enough that she caught the scent of horse and soap and something clean beneath the dust. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The silence said enough. From across the street, someone snickered loudly. Mary Beth stiffened, expecting the stranger to flinch away, to change his mind about speaking to her. But he didn't. He stayed. And when she handed the mended strap back to him, he took it from her like it was something precious. Something worth thanking her for. He smiled. Small, quiet, real. "What's your name?" he asked. Her voice came out so soft he had to lean in to catch it. "Mary Beth," she said. He nodded once, like he was tucking it away somewhere safe. "Call me Eli." And then he was gone, boots thudding lightly against the dust, saddlebag slung over one broad shoulder. Mary Beth sat there a long while after, the needle trembling between her fingers, feeling like something had shifted beneath her skin. The days slipped by, slow and gold as molasses in the heat. Eli stayed in town longer than most strangers did, working odd jobs for the blacksmith, helping with a broken fence at the livery. And every time Mary Beth caught sight of him, it was the same. A nod, a small, steady smile. A wordless kindness that didn't draw attention, didn't mark her like a target, but not everyone missed it. Miss Laurel narrowed her painted eyes whenever Eli lingered near the feed store. Old Mr. Pritchard from the general store muttered darkly into his whiskers when he caught them exchanging a look. "Mark my words," he growled to anyone who'd listen. "Ain't no good ever come from strangers poking their noses where they don't belong." Rumors stirred like snakes in the dry grass. Some said Eli was a drifter looking to stir trouble. Some whispered he had blood on his hands from back east, that he was running from something or someone. Mary Beth heard it all. She tucked it away inside her the way she always had, another stone in the wall she built around her heart. But late at night, when the stars bled silver across the black sky, she thought of him, of the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, like maybe he didn't see the limp or the worn-out dress, or the ghost of all the things she wasn't. Maybe he just saw her. One evening as the sun bled red over the hills, Mary Beth found herself near the livery. She wasn't looking for him, at least that's what she told herself. He was there, elbow deep in a stubborn bridle, cursing softly under his breath. She hovered at the edge of the shadow, unsure, half-turned to flee. Eli looked up and smiled, that small, true smile. "You any good with knots?" he asked, holding up the tangled mess. Mary Beth hesitated, then stepped forward, heart hammering. Together, in the falling dark, they untangled the mess. His hands were big and rough, hers small and quick, and somehow the work between them smoothed the air like a balm. Neither spoke of the rumors. Neither spoke of the danger coiling tighter with every whisper in town, but both of them felt it, like the prickle of lightning before a storm. Somewhere deep in the gathering night, a dog barked once, sharp, warning. A door slammed shut. Boots scraped against gravel. Danger was coming. Mary Beth could feel it in her bones, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't alone to face it. Eli looked at her then, really looked, and tipped his hat back from his brow. "I see you," he said, soft enough that only she could hear. And Mary Beth, broken and battered and half a breath away from vanishing into dust, felt something fierce and new crack open inside her chest. Hope. The first frost came early to Redstone. That year, biting through the thin morning air like a blade, Mary Beth woke to find the world dusted in silver. Roofs, wagon wheels, even the splintered boards of the church steps shimmered with brittle frost. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and hurried toward the market. Winter would come hard and she needed supplies, flour, beans, a few candles if she could stretch her coins. It wasn't until she stepped into the square that she realized something was wrong. The usual mutters and sideways glances were gone. In their place was something worse, a heavy, expectant hush, like the whole town was holding its breath. Mary Beth slowed, heart thudding. At the center of the square, nailed to the message post, fluttered a sheet of paper. At first she thought it was a notice, another lost dog maybe, or a warning about the wolves growing bolder in the hills. But as she drew closer, the blood drained from her face. It was a letter. Her letter, the one Margaret had sent in secret, begging for a match, painting Mary Beth in bright, impossible colors. Someone had found it, copied it, posted it for all to see. Scrawled across the bottom in thick, mocking ink were the words, "Free, to good home, broken stock, guaranteed to limp." Laughter rippled through the crowd, mean and sharp like snapping twigs. Someone whistled low, someone else clapped slowly, a cruel, hollow sound. Mary Beth's throat closed up. She stumbled, backward vision swimming. Her heel caught on a loose cobblestone and she went down hard, scraping her palms against the frozen dirt. The world tilted. Faces loomed over her, sneering, whispering, pointing. Every cruel thing they'd ever thought of her, now pinned up, for all to see. She scrambled to her feet, the blood pounding in her ears louder than the jeers. Her satchel spilled open, scattering thread and torn cloth across the dirt. Someone kicked it aside. Blind with shame, Mary Beth turned and fled. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, away, away. Her limp slowed her, made her clumsy. But she pushed forward, sobbing raggedly, her shawl streaming behind her like a broken wing. The frost was sharper outside town, biting through her thin shoes. She didn't feel it, didn't care. Somewhere, beyond the churchyard, past the old broken fence, she collapsed. The ground was hard and cold beneath her, but she didn't move. Let them laugh. Let them mock. She was nothing. She had always been nothing. The sky above blurred with tears. She closed her eyes. Maybe if she stayed there long enough, the earth would simply take her back. Maybe it would be easier that way. The first thing she felt was the warmth of a coat draped over her shoulders. Not forced, not rushed, just a steady, quiet weight. She blinked, shivering, and found Eli crouching beside her. No words, no grand speeches, just him, boots dusty, hands rough, face open and hurting for her. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He simply sat beside her in the frost and waited. After a long time, when her shivering eased and the tightness in her chest loosened enough for breath, she whispered, "Why are you here?" Eli glanced at her, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat. "Because you shouldn't be alone," he said. Simple as that. No rescue, no pity, just presence. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could reach out and not be slapped down again, but hope was a dangerous thing. She clutched the coat tighter around herself, half hating him for being kind when it would have been easier to leave her in the dirt. "You saw it," she said, voice cracking. He nodded once. "I saw." "And you still—" She shook her head. "You still came?" Eli's mouth twisted, like the words tasted bitter. "I know what it's like," he said slowly, "to be judged for things you didn't choose." She stared at him, blinking against the frost. "Truth is," he went on, picking up a pebble and rolling it between his fingers, "people love to see someone fall. Makes them feel taller." He let the pebble drop, dusting off his hands. "But falling doesn't make you less," he said, looking her square in the eye. "It just makes you human." Tears blurred her vision again, not from shame this time, but something hotter, heavier. She didn't know how long they sat there, the frost creeping up around them, the town bustling oblivious behind them. Eventually, Eli stood, holding out a hand. No command, no demand, just an offer. Mary Beth hesitated. Then slowly she reached out and took it. His hand was rough, calloused, steady. He pulled her up, not like lifting a burden, but like offering a bridge across a broken place. Together, they walked, back toward town. Not arm in arm, not side by side, but close enough that Mary Beth could feel the steady presence of him, like a hearth fire burning against the coming dark. They passed the message post. The letter was still there, fluttering weakly in the wind. Eli paused. Without a word, he reached up and tore it down. He crumpled it in his fist, tossed it into the gutter, and then he kept walking, not looking back once. Mary Beth followed, heart hammering, something fierce and painful blooming in her chest. They thought she was broken, but someone saw gold in the ashes. The days that followed were quieter, but different. People still whispered, still pointed, but Eli didn't leave. He found small reasons to cross her path, needing stitches in a torn saddlebag, looking for extra hands to mend broken fencing, asking about supplies for winter. And each time Mary Beth grew a little braver, she started to speak a little louder, to meet his eyes a little longer. The town didn't change, but Mary Beth did. She wasn't alone anymore. Not because Eli had saved her. She was saving herself. But because he had stood with her when it would have been easier to walk away, and sometimes that was the truest kind of love there was. Before we dive into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. The winter deepened. Snow thickened over Redstone, blanketing the rutted streets and sagging rooftops. The townsfolk huddled closer to their fires, muttering about supplies and sickness and wolves. But out on the edge of town, past the frozen creek, a different kind of fire was growing. Eli's old ranch, a battered, wind-bitten piece of land half the town had given up on, was stirring with new life. Mary Beth stood at the fence line, hammering nails into fresh wood. Her hands ached, her breath steamed in the air, but a fierce kind of pride burned in her chest. It wasn't much, not yet. A patched-up barn, a mended corral, a lean-to that might one day be a proper house. But it was theirs. The first swing of a future they were building. One board, one nail, one promise at a time. The town didn't make it easy. Suppliers forgot orders. Tools went missing. Men jeered when Mary Beth carried lumber across the square, her limp pronounced in the deep drifts of snow. But she kept walking, and Eli kept walking beside her. Sometimes she caught him watching her, a quiet smile hidden beneath. His battered hat, not the smile of a man rescuing a stray, but of a man seeing something powerful rising from ashes. Late one night, sitting by the fire in the half-finished house, Mary Beth asked, "Why this place?" Eli sipped his coffee, staring into the flames. "My father built this ranch," he said slowly. "Every board, every fence post. He poured his whole soul into it." Mary Beth watched him, the firelight carving deep shadows across his face. "But after he died," Eli said, voice rough, "the land went wild. I tried keeping it up, but folks said I was cursed." He gave a wry, bitter laugh. Maybe they were right. "Lost the herds, lost the house, lost everything but my name." He turned to her then, eyes raw and earnest. But maybe losing it all was the only way to make room for something better. Mary Beth swallowed hard. They were both broken things. Both left behind by a world that valued shiny things over strong ones. Maybe that was why she fit here. Why they fit. Days bled into weeks. They worked side by side, fencing, mending, hauling water. Eli taught her how to ride proper, how to coax stubborn mules into pulling, how to read the sky for storms. Mary Beth showed him how to patch clothes, how to set a broken latch, how to braid rope strong enough to hold through the worst winter winds. Slowly, something like laughter returned, something like hope. One night, after a long day's work, Eli pulled something small from his pocket. It was a ring, plain, silver, worn smooth from years of someone's dreaming. "It was my ma's," he said, voice low. "I reckon she'd want you to have it." Mary Beth's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared at the ring, not for what it was, but for what it meant. Belonging. Trust. A future she had barely dared to imagine. With shaking fingers, she slid it onto her hand. The fit was perfect. The fire crackled between them. No vows were spoken. None were needed. The promise was in the work they'd done. In the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with possession, but with respect. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. and that was enough. But peace never lasts long in places like Redstone. Not when old grudges and fresh hatred still smoldered beneath the snow. It started with small things: a slashed fence, a poisoned well, warnings, threats. Mary Beth knew who was behind it. Sheriff Boone and his boys, the same ones who had laughed loudest when her shame had been nailed to the town square. Boone didn't like seeing someone he'd marked as broken standing, tall. Didn't like seeing a woman he'd once mocked building something stronger than anything he could tear down. He came to the ranch one morning, heavy in the saddle, 2 deputies flanking him. "You don't belong out here," Boone said, spitting into the snow. "This land's bad luck, always was." Eli stood square in the doorway of the half-built house, arms crossed, jaw set. Mary Beth stepped up beside him, chin high. "We make our own luck," she said. Boone's lip curled. "Suit yourself. But don't come crying when winter chews you up and spits you out." He tipped his hat mockingly and rode off, his men laughing behind him. That night, the wind howled like wolves through the rafters. Mary Beth couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, running her fingers over the smooth silver of the ring, thinking about the life they were fighting for, and the cost. Eli found her there, silent and heavy-eyed. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked, not accusing, just weary. Mary Beth shook her head. "I'm thinking about staying," she whispered. "Even when it hurts." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Good," he said simply. "Because I'm thinking about fighting." She smiled then, a small, fierce thing. Together, they would stand, no matter what winter, or Boone, threw at them. But the final test wasn't a storm, or a raid, or a fire. It was fear. Her fear. Fear that she wasn't enough. That she would always carry the shame stitched into her skin. That sooner or later Eli would see it too. And leave. One bitter morning after repairing a collapsed chicken coop, Mary Beth snapped. "I don't belong here," she said, flinging down the hammer. Eli looked up, startled. "I'm not strong enough. Not good enough. I'll only drag you down." He set his tools aside carefully. "Where's this coming from?" She laughed bitterly. From every stare, every whisper, every letter nailed to a post. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't care anymore. "I can't give you a fresh start. I can't wipe away the past." Eli crossed the frozen yard in 3 strides and caught her by the shoulders. His hands were firm but gentle. "You think I chose you in spite of your past?" he said, voice low and rough. "I chose you because of it." Mary Beth blinked, stunned. "Every scar," he said. "Every limp. Every hard-earned piece of you. It's yours. You fought for it." He touched her cheek, brushing away a frozen tear. "And I'm proud to stand beside you." Her chest cracked open at his words, all the fear and shame bleeding out into the cold air. Slowly, she leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around her, sheltering her from the wind, from the town, from everything that had ever tried to break her. For the first time in her life, Mary Beth didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a battle won. Spring would come, with floods, with storms, with new wolves, and new threats. But they would face it together. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Hand in hand, hearts patched and mended, like the ranch they called home. And this time, Mary Beth vowed, no one, not Boone, not the town, not even her own fear, would tear it from her. The thaw came late that year. Snow melted, in slow, stubborn patches, revealing the battered scars of winter, broken fences, mud-churned roads, and the graves of things too weak to survive the cold. Mary Beth stood in the square of Redstone, the cracked boards of the gallows platform. Under her boots, the townsfolk circling like crows. Sheriff Boone sat astride his horse, smirking. "You think a little hammer and nails makes you one of us?" he drawled. "You think a ring and a broken-down ranch wipes away the past?" His voice was loud, meant for the whole town to hear. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. "That's the crippled girl, ain't it?" She lied, tricked him, tricked. Should have stayed in the shadows where she belonged. Mary Beth lifted her chin, the silver ring glinting on her hand. The scar at her temple burned under their stares. But she didn't flinch. Maybe once, she would have crumbled. Maybe once, she would have run, but not now. Not after everything she and Eli had built together from nothing. Not after the night spent stitching hope into broken beams and frozen soil. Boone leaned forward in the saddle, voice oily with satisfaction. Even now, nobody here wants you. And then, before Mary Beth could answer, she heard the steady sound of boots crossing the square. Eli. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked through the crowd, every step carving a path that couldn't be erased. When he reached her, he didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for their approval. He just took her hand, rough, work-worn, scarred like her own, and raised it high. "I do," Eli said, voice like iron. "I want her. I choose her." Silence cracked across Redstone like a gunshot. No preacher, no fancy words, just a man choosing a woman in the full glare of every lie and every whisper. Mary Beth's throat closed up a lie. Turned to her, eyes steady. "Not because you're perfect," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "But because you're real, and strong, and mine. If you'll have me." Tears blurred her vision, but she squeezed his hand back. Firm as a vow. "I'll have you," she whispered. They didn't need a church. They didn't need the town's blessing. That night, under a sky poured thick with stars, Mary Beth and Eli stood behind the barn they'd built with their own battered hands. The earth smelled of thawing soil and new chances. The mountains loomed like quiet witnesses. Eli pulled a simple chain from his pocket, a locket he'd found half buried near the creek, polished and repaired until it gleamed. Inside, he had placed a scrap of their story, a lock of Mary Beth's hair, a pressed wildflower from the first day she smiled without fear. He clasped it around her neck, fingers trembling. "No matter what," he said, voice rough with promise. "You'll never be left behind again." Mary Beth pressed her forehead against his. In the distance, wolves howled, not in threat, but in chorus, as if even the wild things knew a new life had begun. Spring carved green veins across the valley. The ranch grew stronger, stubborn against the wind. A foal was born, small and trembling but fierce, and Mary Beth named him Chance. Sometimes, when the work was heavy and the ghosts pressed too close, Mary Beth would ride Chance along the old trails, her locket thumping warm against her heart. Sometimes she passed Redstone. Sometimes she didn't. It didn't matter. She had built her own world now, with Eli, with hope stitched into every nail and every sunrise. One evening, as the sun bled into the western hills, Eli found her sitting on the fence line, watching Chance buck and stumble through the new grass. He sat beside her without a word, their shoulders brushing. Mary Beth turned to him, the locket cool against her skin, the ring heavy on her hand. "You still sure?" she teased, a soft, crooked smile pulling at her lips. Eli chuckled low in his chest. "Sure as sunrise," he said, squeezing her hand. They sat there as the stars kindled overhead, as the wolves sang and the mountains swallowed the last of the light. No crowds, no noise, just two broken souls stitched together by choice and not pity. And that, Mary Beth thought, was the only miracle she'd ever needed. Closing lines. She was never a curse. She was someone's miracle all along. Subscribe now, and let me introduce you to the next miracle tomorrow.